Hey, I heard you know how to move in light armor. Welcome back to another Elder Scrolls video. No super fancy expository intro today. We are just going to go into two different stories found inside the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion that surround the use of what the game classifies as light armor. The Rear Guard by Tenence Mori and Ice in Chitin by Pletius Spadek. The Rear Guard is the story of a lone Bosmer guarding a besieged castle and how he obtains his food with the help of netch leather armor. It can be found here, in the training room in the sanctuary of the Dark Brotherhood. The castle would hold. No matter the forces, the walls of Cascabel Hall would never fail. But that was small consolation for Menegar. He was hungry. In fact, he had never been so hungry. The well in the atrium of the fortress supplied him with enough water to hold him until the Fourth Era, but his stomach reminded Menegar minute to minute that he needed food. The wagon load of supplies mocked him. When his army, the forces of the King of Solitude, had left Cascabel Hall, and he had made the battlements as the rear guard to protect their retreat, they had left a wagon behind to supply him with enough food for months. It was not until the night after they left that he inspected the larder and found that nothing edible was in the wagon. Trunk after trunk was filled with netch armor from the army's incursion into Morrowind. Apparently his Nord confederates had assumed that the lightly opaque material was hardtack in aspic. If the Dunmer whose caravan had been raided knew about this, they would never be able to stop laughing. Menegar thought that his fellow mercenary and kinswoman, Erin, would have found this amusing as well. She had spoken with great authority about netch leather, being an expert of sorts on light armor. She had made a point to mention that it could not be eaten like other leather in occasions of hardship. It was a pity she couldn't be here to enjoy the irony, Menegar thought savagely. She had returned to Morrowind, even before the king's army had left, preferring a life as a wanted fugitive to a free existence in the cold of Skyrim. All the weeds in the courtyard had been devoured by the rear guard's 16th day manning Cascabel Hall. The entire castle had been scoured, rotten tubers in the mulch pile found and consumed. A dusty bouquet in the Countess's bedchamber eaten. Almost every rat and insect, but the most cunning infesting the castle walls, had been tracked down and gobbled up. The castellan's chambers, filled with acrid, inedible law books, had yielded a couple of crumbs of bread. Menegar had even scraped moss from the stones. There was no denying it. He would be dead from starvation before his armies returned to break the ranks of the enemies who surrounded the fortress. "The worst part," said Menegar, who had taken to talking to himself on only the second day alone in the castle, "is how close sustenance is." A vast arbor of golden apples stretched acre after acre near the castle walls. The sunlight cast a seductive gleam on the fruit, and the cruel wind carried sweet smells into Cascabel to torture him. Like most Bosmer, Menegar was an archer. He was a master of long and medium distance fighting, but in close quarters, as he would be if he dared leave the castle and enter the enemy camp in the arbor, he knew he would not last long. At some point, he knew he would have to try, but he was dreading the day. It was upon him now. Menegar put on the netch armor for the first time, feeling the powdery, almost velvet texture of the rendered leather against his skin. There was also a barely perceptible throb, which he realized was the remnant nematocyst of the netch's venomous flesh, still tingling months after its death with domesticated poison. The combination had made him feel energized. Erin had described the sensation perfectly, just as she had explained how to defend himself while wearing netch leather armor. Under the cover of night, Menegar crept out the back gate of the castle, locking it behind him with a rather cumbersome key. He made for the arbor as quietly as he could, but a passing sentry coming behind a tree saw him. Remaining calm, Menegar did as he remembered Erin had instructed, only moving after the attack had been launched. The sentry's blade glided against the armor and knocked to the left, throwing the young man off balance. That was the trick, as he understood it. You had to be prepared to be hit, and merely move with the blow, allowing the membranous armor to divert the injury away. Use your enemy's momentum against him, as Erin used to say. There were several more close encounters in the arbor, but each swing of the axe and each thrust of the sword found purchase elsewhere. With handfuls of apples, Menegar ran the gauntlet back to the castle. He locked the back gate door behind him and fell into an orgy of eating. For week after week, the Bosmer stole out to gather his food. The guards began anticipating his raids, but he kept his schedule irregular and always remembered, when attacked, to wait for the blow, accept it, then turn. In such a way he lived and survived his lonely vigil in Cascabel Hall. 4 months later, as he was preparing for another seizure of apples, Menegar heard a loud clamor at the front gate. Surveying the group from a safe distance on the battlements, he saw the shields of the King of Solitude, his ally, the Count of Cascabel, and their enemy, the King of Faerun. Evidently, a truce had been called. Menegar opened the gates, and the combined armies flooded the courtyard. Many of the knights of Faerun sought to shake the hand of the man they had named the Shadow of the Arbor, expressing their admiration at his defensive skills and apologizing good-naturedly for their attempts to slay him, only doing their job, you know. There's hardly an apple left on the vines. Well, I started at the edges and explained to Menegar. I brought back extra fruit to tempt the rats out of the walls so I can have a little meat as well. We've spent the last several months working out the details of the truce, said the king. Really quite exhausting. At any rate, the Count will be taking back possession of his castle now. But there is a small detail we need to work out. You're a mercenary, and as such, responsible for your own expenses. If you were a subject of mine, things might be different. But there are certain old rules of law that must be respected. Menegar anticipated the strike. The problem is, the king continued, you've taken a good deal of the Count's crops while here. By any reasonable computation, you've eaten an amount equal to and likely exceeding your mercenaries' wages. Obviously, I will not be penalizing you for the excellent job you've done defending the castle in uncomfortable circumstances. But you agree that it's important that we observe the old rules of law, don't you? Of course, replied Menegar, accepting the blow. I'm delighted to hear that, said the king. Our estimation is that you owe the Count of Cascabel 37 imperial gold, which I will gladly pay to myself, with interest, after the autumn time harvest, said Menegar. There's more left on the vines than you suggest. The kings of Solitude and Faerun, and the Count of Cascabel, stared at the Bosmer. We've agreed to abide by the strictest old rules of law, and I've had time to read a great many books over the time you were making your truce. In the Third Era, 246, during the reign of Uriel IV, the Imperial Council, in an attempt to clear up some questions of property rights in Skyrim during those chaotic days, decreed that any man without a liege who occupied a castle for more than 3 months would be granted the rights and titles of that estate. It's a good law, of course, meant to discourage absent and foreign landlords. Menegar smiled, feeling now a familiar sensation of a glancing strike diverted. By the rule of law, I am the Count of Cascabel. The rearguard's son still holds the title of the Count of Cascabel, and he grows the finest, most delectable apples in the Empire. And finally, Ice and Chitin, the tale of a group of Imperial soldiers surviving the elements with only Chitin to protect them. Also, a little side note, why did no one tell me it was pronounced chitin? I've always said chitin, and I don't know why. And I feel like I've never heard it said in a video before for my brain to be like, no, it's definitely chitin, but I am so glad I googled it before I said it 1,000 times. And you can find a copy here, in Adarji's house, in Leowin. The tale dates to the year 855 of the Second Era, after General Talos had taken the name Tiber Septim and began his conquest of Tamriel. One of his commanding officers, Betia of Iliolos, had been surprised in an ambush while returning from a meeting with the Emperor. She and her personal guard of 5 soldiers barely escaped and were separated from the army. They fled across the desolate, sleet-painted rocky cliffs by foot. The attack had been so sudden, they had not even the time to don armor or get to their horses. "If we can get to Gorvig Ridge," hollered Lieutenant Escutus, gesturing toward the peak of the mist, his voice barely discernible over the wind. "We can meet the Legion you stationed in Pornak." Betia looked across the craggy landscape through the windswept, hoary trees and shook her head. "Not that way. We'll be struck down before we make it halfway to the mountain. You can see their horses' breath through the trees." She directed her guard toward a ruined old keep on the frozen isthmus of Nerone, across the bay from Gorvig Ridge, jutting out on a promontory of rock. It was like many other abandoned castles in northern Skyrim, remnants of Riemann Cyrodiil's protective shield against the continent of Akavir. As they reached their destination and made a fire, they can hear the army of the war chief of Dan Strar behind them, making camp on the land southwest, blocking the only escape but the sea. The soldiers assessed the stock of the keep, while Betia looked out to the fog-veiled water through the casements of the ruin. She threw a stone, watching it skip across the ice, trailing puffs of mist before it disappeared with a splash into the crack in the surface. "No food or weaponry can be found, Commander," Lieutenant Escutus reported. "There's a pile of armor in storage, but it's definitely taken on the elements over the years. I don't know if it's salvageable at all." "We won't last long here," Betia replied. "The Nords know we'll be vulnerable when night falls, and this old rock won't hold them off. If there's anything in the keep we can use, find it. We have to make it across the ice floe to the ridge." After a few minutes of searching and matching pieces, the guards presented 2 very grimy, scuffed, and cracked suits of chitin armor. Even the least proud of adventurers and pirates who had looted the castle over the years had thought the shells of chitin beneath their notice. The soldiers did not dare to clean them. The dust looked to be the only adhesive holding them together. "They won't offer us much protection. Just slow us down," grimaced Escutus. "If we can run across the ice as soon as it gets dark." "Anyone who can plan and execute an ambush like the war chiefs of Danstra will be expecting that. We need to move quickly, now, before they're any closer." Betia drew a map of the bay in the dust, and then a semicircle path across the water, an arc stretching from the castle to Gorvig Ridge. "The men should go the long way across the bay, like so. The ice is thick. There are ways from the shoreline, and there are a lot of rocks for cover." "You are not staying behind to hold the castle." "Of course not." Betia shook her head and drew a straight line from the castle to the closest shore across the bay. "I'll take one of the chitin suits and try to cross the water here. If you don't see or hear me when you've made it to land, don't wait. Just get to Pornak." Lieutenant Escutus tried to dissuade his commander, but he knew she would never order one of her men to perform the suicidal act of diversion. That all would die before they reached Gorvig Ridge if the warlord's army was not distracted. He could find only one way to honor his duty, to protect his commanding officer. It was not easy convincing Commander Betia that he should accompany her, but at last she relented. The sun hung low, but still cast a diffused glow, illuminating the snow in a ghostly light. When the 5 men and 1 woman slipped through the borders beneath the castle to the water's frozen edge, Betia and Escutus moved carefully and precisely, painfully aware of each dull crunch of chitin against the stone. At their commander's signal, the 4 unarmed men dashed towards the north, across the ice. When her men reached the first fragment of cover, a spiral of stone jutting a few yards from the base of the promontory, Betia turned to listen for the sound of the army above. Nothing but silence. They were still unseen. Escutus nodded, his eyes through his helm showing no fear. The commander and her lieutenants stepped onto the ice and began to run. When Betia had surveyed the bay from the castle ramparts, the crossing closest to shore had seemed like a vast, featureless plain of white. Now that she was down on the ice, it was even more flat and stark. The sheet of mist only rose up to their ankles, but it billowed up at their approach, like the hand of nature itself was pointing out their presence to their enemies. They were utterly exposed. It came almost as a relief when Betia heard one of the war chief's scouts whistle, a signal to his master. They didn't have to turn around to see if the army was coming. The sound of galloping hooves and the crash of trees giving way was very clear over the whistling wind. Betia wished she could risk a glance to the north to see if her men were hidden from view, but she didn't dare. She could hear Scutus running to her right, keeping pace, breathing hard. He was used to wearing heavier armor, but the chitin joints were so brittle and tight from years of disuse, it was all he could do to bend them. The rocky shore to the ridge still looked an eternity away when Betia felt and heard the first volley of arrows. Most struck the ice at their feet with sharp, cracking sounds, but a few nearly found home, ricocheting off their backs. She silently offered a prayer of thanks to whatever anonymous shellsmith, now long dead, had crafted the armor. They continued to run, as the first rain of arrows was quickly followed by a second and a third. "Ah, thanks, Dundar," Ascutus gasped. "If there were only leather in the keep, we'd be pierced through and through. Now if only it weren't. So rigid." Betia felt her own armor joints begin to set, her knees and hips finding more and more resistance with every step. There could be no denying it. They were drawing closer to shore, but they were running much more slowly. She heard the first dreadful galloping crunch of the army charging across the floe toward them. The riders were cautious on the slippery ice, not driving their horses at full speed, but Betia knew they would be upon the two of them soon. The old chitin armor could withstand the bite of a few arrows, but not a lance driven with the force of a galloping horse. The only great unknown was time. The thunder of beating hooves was deafening behind them when Acustus and Betia reached the edge of the shore. The giant, jagged stones that strung around the beach blockaded the approach. Beneath their feet, the ice sighed and crackled. They could not stand still, run forward, nor run back. Straining against the tired metal in the armored joints, they took 2 bounds forward and flew at the boulders. The first landing on the ice sounded like an explosive crack. When they rose from the final jump, it was on a wave of water so cold it felt like fire through the thin armor. Ascutus's right hand found purchase in a deep fissure. Betia gripped with both hands, but her boulder was slick with frost. Faces pressed to the stone, they could not turn to face the army behind them. But they heard the ice splintering, and the soldiers cry out in terror for just an instant. Then there was no sound, but the waning of the wind and the purring lap of the water. A moment later, there were footsteps on the cliff above. The 4 guardsmen had crossed the bay. There were 2 to pull Betia up from the face of the boulder, and another 2 for Ascutus. They strained and swore at the weight, but finally they had their commander and her lieutenant safely on the edge of Gorvig Ridge. "By Mara, that's heavy for light armor." "Yes," smiled Betia wearily, looking back over the empty, broken ice floe, the cracks radiating from the parallel paths she and Ascutus had run. "But sometimes, that's good." Hey, thanks for watching that thing you just watched. This is my first time really experimenting with the free cam in Skyrim, trying to get footage, and honestly, I hate it so much more than free cam in Oblivion. It was very hard to get the footage for that half of the video, but hopefully it didn't turn out too unbelievably horrible. And if you thought that this was not unbelievably horrible, do the like, do the comment, do the subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. There is also a backlog of other lore videos if you want to see whatever's probably popping up right about now. And as always, remember, wait for the blow, accept it, then turn.